Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about a conspiracy theory that Jesus Christ was a figure created by the Roman Empire as a form of psychological operations against the Jewish people. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut erat in principio, et nunc et semper, et saecula saeculorum. Amen. All right, so we have some similar videos about this. For example, we have one where retorting to atheists who believe that Jesus was completely fabricated. And this is kind of on the tangent of that. But there are a couple people like Joseph Atwill, for example, and similar people believe that the Palestinian region at that time, 1st century BC, 1st century AD, was a place of tumult and a place of rebellion that the Roman Empire to deal with, and that there were a lot of prophets, false messiahs. And so the theory is that as a way to quell the constant rebellions that were going on at the time in the Holy Land, that they created Jesus Christ. They fabricated him, and in fact the gospel writers and the evangelists were all in fact Roman aristocrats who created this story that Jesus Christ was fabricated, because they realized that the kind of false messiahs that were very common during that time were pushing for the end of Roman occupation and so forth. And so by bringing in a Messiah that was more about turn the other cheek, forgive your enemies, and you should tax the Romans what they deserve to be taxed, that it was a way for them to Psy-Ops the Jewish people of the turn of the millennia at that time. Now, some of this maybe would make sense if you knew absolutely no history whatsoever, but this is just ridiculously stupid. First of all, yes, there were false messiahs during this time. And yes, Palestine during that time was an area that did not want to be under Roman occupation. I mean, there were some parts of the Roman Empire that were overall pretty peaceful. You look at like Hispania, like Spain. But yes, that's absolutely true. The Jewish people had a history of a lot of occupation, even if you go more recent to the Romans. But you had the successors to Alexander the Great occupied it. We know this like with the Maccabees, books of the Old Testament. So that's true. But look, here are a couple of problems with this idea. First of all, Josephus is a well-known Jewish historian of this time, and he was writing about Jesus and about other kind of leaders at that time. And he was very close with the Romans. He was a pro-Romophile because he believed that Rome was bringing civilization and safety on the roads and all these things. And he doesn't mention anything like that Rome fabricated Jesus. And believe me, the early Jews were no fans of early Christianity. You look at the book of Apocalypse, a lot of the tyranny that's going on there is a metaphor for the tyranny of not just the Roman persecution of the time, but also the Jewish persecution of the time. We knew that the Jews of that time heavily persecuted the Christians. You could see James, one of the early fathers of the church, was thrown off a parapet and clubbed in the head by the Jews. And so there was no love lost there. But I think the biggest problem with this theory is simply that two things. It didn't work, in that you had two humongous Jewish rebellions that occurred within a generation of Jesus' death. You have the big one in AD 70, and then you have the follow-up in 133 AD, where the Jewish people rebelled against Rome on both occasions, and Rome came and just wiped out and destroyed the temple and essentially scattered the Jews. So clearly it didn't work. And secondly, who was the biggest persecutor of early Christians until Christianity was legalized by Constantine in 313 AD? It was the Romans. So it doesn't make sense. Probably the most famous early persecution is the Neroese persecution that took St. Peter and St. Paul in the 60s. But all through the first few hundred years of Christian history, all the way up to the Decian persecution and Diocletian persecutions that were right before Constantine, they were persecuting Christians left and right. If you look at the large majority of popes, were all early martyrs. We talked about Ignatius of Antioch. He's one of the apostolic fathers. He wrote a lot of his letters that were very Catholic in the early 100s on the way to Rome to be killed. We know that the Roman authorities tried to kill John the Evangelist, but through a miracle, they were not successful. So this idea that the Romans fabricated Jesus as a way to pacify the Jews is inconsistent with the actual history of the Romans wanting to destroy Christianity just as much as the Jews did throughout its entire existence, until by that point, through the blood of the martyrs, because the Christian way compared to the pagan way was a hard way. It was very liberating for women, but as a whole, you can see this really played out in the Corinthians epistles, it was a hard choice to make for the majority of people. But through the blood of the martyrs, Christianity spread throughout the whole entire Roman Empire, and certainly spread east, which we really don't talk about. And through that came conversion of people to the point where Constantine legalized it. He wasn't a Christian until his death. His mother, of course, was a famous Christian who went to the Holy Land and brought back a lot of Christ's relics, like the cross. But it was a major kind of infusion of Christianity for those last 100 years, and he legalized it and allowed public worship so the Christians could come out of the catacombs and people's houses, and he loaned out some buildings so they could have their first churches, like the Lateran Church in Rome is a great example of that. And then Christianity grew so much, and we have that episode on how the 4th century is truly a century of so much development and strife, and again, to use the word tumult. But by the end of the 4th century, you have the prohibition of pagan religions in the Roman Empire, where Christianity, through the Edict of Milan, really it was really Catholicism, because that was the only Christian faith at the time, was designated as the only official religion of the Roman Empire within 65 years of Constantine just legalizing. And that's the power of the message of Jesus Christ, and the power of the Bible, and the power of the church. So in closing, you'll always get these people who will come up with just crazy, spurious theories to undermine the faith. But you got to know your history if you're going to come up with legitimate stuff. And sure, you can just do it the legitimate kind of, the resurrection never happened. What's your proof of the resurrection? And in Christians, we have responses to these, but those are going to be a little more credible than Jesus Christ was fabricated by Roman aristocrats, and he was a psy-op against the Jewish people. It's like, come on, let's do your history at will. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Hit the notification, subscribe, and share button. Until next time, take care. God bless and pray.